Stephen Miller thought he could silence Jasmine Crockett with interruptions and intimidation tactics. He cut her off 6 times in a row, his voice getting louder and more aggressive with each attempt to shut her down. The committee room fell, silent as tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. But what Congresswoman Crockett said on her 7th attempt didn't just silence Miller. It completely destroyed his argument and left him speechless for the first time in his political career. The moment that followed would break the internet, spark millions of views across social media, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against bullying isn't fighting back with the same tactics. It's using precision, truth, and perfect timing to deliver a knockout blow that no one sees coming. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these epic political moments. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's jump into the story that has everyone talking. The hearing room was packed that Tuesday morning, cameras rolling as the Immigration Policy Committee prepared for what many expected to be a routine session. But nothing about this day would be routine. Stephen Miller, former White House advisor and current policy consultant, sat at the witness table with his trademark confidence, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his expression carrying that familiar smirk that had become his signature during years of controversial political battles. The room itself buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled the press gallery, their laptops open and fingers ready to type the moment something newsworthy happened. Spectators lined the walls, some wearing MAGA hats, others sporting Democratic pins. The air conditioning hummed quietly, but it couldn't cool the tension that seemed to radiate from every corner of the space. Miller's legal team sat behind him, briefcases organized with military precision. They prepared him for every possible line of questioning, armed him with statistics, talking points, and deflection strategies. This was their star witness, the man who could handle any hostile questioner and turn any attack back on his accusers. They'd seen him do it dozens of times before. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone and reviewed her notes one final time. The Texas Democrat had prepared extensively for this moment, knowing that Miller's reputation for aggressive tactics and verbal warfare preceded him. She'd watched hours of footage, studied his patterns, and was ready for whatever he might throw at her. Her own staff had spent weeks preparing for this 15-minute questioning period. They'd compiled documents, cross-reference reports, and mapped out potential response strategies. But Crockett's real preparation had come from 15 years of courtroom battles where hostile witnesses and aggressive opposing counsel had tried every trick in the book to silence her. What she wasn't prepared for was how relentlessly he would try to silence her. To understand the explosive confrontation that was about to unfold, you need to know exactly who these two political heavyweights are and why this battle mattered so much. Stephen Miller had built his entire career on being the man who never backed down from a fight. At 38, he'd already become one of the most recognizable faces in immigration policy, known for his hardline stances and his ability to dominate any room he entered. His supporters saw him as a brilliant strategist who fought for American workers. His critics called him something much less flattering, but everyone agreed on one thing. Miller knew how to control a conversation and rarely lost a verbal sparring match. He'd come to this hearing with a clear strategy: defend the previous administration's immigration policies and attack any criticism as political theater. Miller had testified before Congress dozens of times, and he had a simple formula that had worked every time before: interrupt, redirect, and overwhelm his questioners with rapid-fire responses that left them struggling to regain control. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old freshman congresswoman who had quickly earned a reputation as one of the most effective questioners in the House. A former civil rights attorney from Dallas, Crockett had spent years in courtrooms facing down hostile witnesses and aggressive opposing counsel. She knew how to handle bullies because she'd been dealing with them her entire professional life. But this wasn't just about two political figures clashing over policy. The stakes were much higher than that. Crockett represented a new generation of Democratic leadership, young, diverse, and absolutely fearless when it came to confronting what she saw as injustice. She'd been elected on a promise to hold powerful people accountable regardless of their reputation or their ability to intimidate others. Her constituents in Texas had sent her to Congress specifically to ask the tough questions that others were afraid to ask. Miller, meanwhile, represented the old guard's approach to political combat: dominate through aggression, control the narrative through volume and interruption, and never let your opponent finish a thought that might damage your position. His entire political brand was built on being the person who could out-talk, out-argue, and outmaneuver anyone who challenged him. He perfected this approach through years of hostile media, interviews, congressional testimony, and political debates. Miller understood that in the age of social media and short attention spans, controlling the conversation mattered more than actually answering questions. His strategy was always the same: overwhelm questioners with rapid-fire responses, shift blame to previous administrations, and make any critic look uninformed or partisan. His supporters loved this approach because it made them feel like their champion was always winning, always fighting back against what they saw as unfair attacks. From biased politicians and hostile media, to them, Miller's interruptions weren't rude. They were necessary combat, tactics against opponents who would twist his words if given the chance. The immigration hearing had drawn national attention because of recent policy changes that had affected thousands of families. Crockett had been assigned a crucial 15-minute questioning period to address allegations about family separations, detention conditions, and policy implementations that had sparked nationwide protests. Miller had been brought in as the star witness to defend these policies, and everyone in the room knew he was there to shut down any criticism and make the questioners look unprepared and partisan. His team had briefed him extensively on each committee member, and they'd identified Crockett as someone who might ask uncomfortable questions. Their strategy was simple: don't let her ask them. What Miller didn't know was that Crockett had been preparing for this exact scenario. She'd studied video of every interruption tactic he'd ever used, analyzed his patterns, and developed a strategy that would turn his greatest strength into his most devastating weakness. The committee chairman called the session to order, and the cameras focused on both figures as they prepared for what would become one of the most talked-about exchanges in recent political history. Miller straightened his tie and leaned toward his microphone, ready to deploy the tactics that had made him famous. Crockett took a deep breath, looked directly at him, and prepared to show the country what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and when someone finally refuses to be silenced. The committee chairman recognized Congresswoman Crockett for her 15-minute questioning period, and she began with what seemed like a straightforward question about policy implementation timelines. But Miller immediately sensed where she was heading and decided to cut her off before she could build momentum. Mr. Miller, regarding the family separation protocols that were implemented in 2018, can you explain the timeline for when families were supposed to be? Congresswoman, Miller interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through hers like a knife. I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding the legal framework here. What you're calling family separation was actually a law enforcement response to illegal border crossings. And if you'd read the actual statute, his interruption was swift and calculated, designed to throw her off balance from the very first question. Miller's media training had taught him that the first few seconds of any hostile exchange were crucial. Establish dominance early. Control the narrative from the beginning and never let an opponent build momentum. Crockett paused, her pen hovering over her notes. The interruption was exactly what she'd expected, but she remained calm. Mr. Miller, I appreciate your perspective, but I'd like to finish my question first. She tried again, as I was saying, regarding the timeline for family reunification. No, Miller said, waving his hand dismissively. You can't just throw around inflammatory terms like family separation without context. The media has completely distorted what actually happened. And frankly, questions like yours are exactly why the American people don't trust Congress to have serious policy discussions. Murmurs rippled through the hearing room. Miller's supporters in the gallery nodded approvingly, while Crockett's allies looked on with growing frustration. But Crockett herself remained perfectly composed, making notes on her pad. Committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Miller's interruption tactics weren't unusual, but the aggressive tone early in the questioning, was raising eyebrows even among his supporters. Crockett looked up from her notes, her voice steady. "Mr. Miller, I understand you have strong feelings about this issue, but I have a limited time for questions, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to ask them." She began her third attempt. "According to documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests, your office sent a memo on June 15, 2018 that specifically outlined, oh, here we go, with the leaked documents," Miller said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Congresswoman, if you're going to rely on cherry-picked memos taken out of context by partisan activists, then we're not having a serious conversation. We're having political theater." He leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, clearly enjoying the disruption. His body language was textbook dominance, arms spread wide across the back of his chair, chin slightly raised, eyes scanning the room as if addressing an audience rather than answering a question. This was Miller in his element, performing the role that had made him famous. Maybe instead of reading from opposition research, you could ask about the actual results of our policies, like the dramatic reduction in illegal crossings or the disruption of human trafficking networks. The dismissive wave of his hand as he spoke was another calculated gesture designed to make Crockett's question seem trivial and unworthy of serious response. Miller had perfected this combination of verbal aggression and physical dismissiveness through years of hostile interviews. Crockett's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained calm. Several committee members began to look annoyed at Miller's behavior, but no one interrupted to restore order. "Mr. Miller," Crockett said, "I'm trying to ask about specific policy implementations based on official government documents. Are you saying these documents are fabricated?" She tried once more. "The memo I'm referencing states that separation would occur regardless of age, including infants and toddlers. Can you explain how this policy serves the interests of—" "Stop right there," Miller snapped, pointing his finger at her. "You're doing exactly what I expected, taking a single line from a complex document and weaponizing it for political points. This is why serious policy experts can have real discussions with politicians who are more interested in sound bites than solutions." His voice grew louder and more aggressive. "You want to talk about children? Let's talk about the children who are being trafficked across our border by criminal organizations. Let's talk about the children who are being used as human shields by adults who weren't even their parents. But you don't want to talk about that, do you? Because it doesn't fit your narrative." The room was now buzzing with tension. Some spectators were taking notes furiously, while others pulled out their phones to record. Social media was already starting to light up with clips of the increasingly heated exchange. Crockett remained remarkably calm, but there was something different in her posture now, a subtle straightening of her shoulders that suggested she was preparing for something. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I notice you haven't actually answered any of my questions about the specific policies. Are you unable to defend them, or are you simply choosing not to?" Miller's eyes flashed with anger. "I'm choosing not to engage with gotcha questions designed to create viral moments instead of actual oversight. If you want to have a serious discussion about immigration policy, I'm here for it. If you want to grandstand for your Twitter followers, find someone else." Crockett nodded slowly and shuffled through her papers. When she looked up, there was something in her expression that Miller didn't recognize, a kind of quiet confidence that should have warned him to be more careful. "Let me try a different approach," she said. "Mr. Miller, You've worked in immigration policy for over a decade in your professional opinion. Oh, please, Miller said with a dismissive laugh. Don't pretend this is about my professional opinion. This is about you trying to get a soundbite that makes you look tough on cable news tonight. I've seen this playbook 100 times. Congresswoman. Freshman members come in here thinking they can make a name for themselves by attacking experienced professionals who actually understand these issues. He gestured broadly at the room. You've been in Congress for, 2 years? And you think you understand immigration policy better than someone who's been working on it since before you decided to run for office? This is exactly what's wrong with our political system. Inexperienced politicians grandstanding instead of learning. The room had gone almost completely silent. Even Miller's supporters looked uncomfortable with the personal nature of his attack. Committee members were exchanging glances, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Crockett set down her pen and looked directly at Miller. For the first time since the questioning began, she smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile that courtroom opponents had learned to fear. Mr. Miller, she said quietly, thank you for that assessment. Now I have a question for you. Miller leaned forward, clearly ready to interrupt again, but something in her tone made him pause. The room held its breath. Crockett's voice was calm, measured, and deadly precise. Mr. Miller, if you're such an experienced immigration policy expert, can you explain why the family reunification database you were responsible for creating had no system for tracking which children belonged to which parents? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Miller opened his mouth to interrupt again, but Crockett wasn't finished. Her voice grew stronger, more confident, because according to your own Inspector General's report, not leaked documents, not opposition research, but your own government's official findings, your policy separated 2,816 children from their families without any reliable method of reunification. You literally took babies from their parents and didn't write down where you put them. Miller's face went pale. The smirk disappeared completely. And when you were asked about this by your own staff, your response, and I'm reading directly from the Inspector General's report now, was that's not my problem. That's for the downstream agencies to figure out. The room was dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming. So, here's my question, Mr. Miller, and I'd appreciate if you could answer it without interrupting me this time. How does a man who claims to be an immigration policy expert implement a policy that deliberately separates families without creating any system to put them back together? Because that doesn't sound like expertise to me. That sounds like either incompetence or cruelty, and I'm trying to figure out which one it is. Miller sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. For the first time in his political career, he had no response ready. The man who had built his reputation on never being speechless was completely speechless. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then someone in the gallery gasped. A committee member leaned forward in his chair. Camera operators zoomed in on Miller's stunned face. Crockett wasn't done. While you're thinking about that answer, let me ask you another question. During your tenure, 545 children were never reunited with their families. 545 children, Mr. Miller. Some of them were infants, babies who can't even say their own names, let alone their parents' names. Her voice grew more passionate, but remained controlled. You want to talk about experience? You want to talk about expertise? I've been a civil rights attorney for 15 years. I've represented families torn apart by systems that didn't care about their humanity. And what I see here is an expertise. It's a man who treated human beings like paperwork and then got angry when someone asked him to account for it. Miller finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak whisper. Congresswoman, that's not the processes. Were the processes what, Mr. Miller? Were they designed to inflict maximum trauma on families? Because that's what they accomplished. Crockett leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. You interrupted me 6 times in the last 10 minutes because you didn't want the American people to hear these questions. You attacked my experience, my qualifications, and my motives because you hoped you could bully me into backing down." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But here's what you didn't count on. I spent years in courtrooms dealing with men who thought they could intimidate me into silence. I faced down prosecutors who tried to steamroll my clients, judges who dismissed my arguments, and opposing counsel who thought a young black woman couldn't possibly know what she was talking about." Miller was now visibly shaking, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His face had gone from its usual confident pour to a deep red that spread from his collar to his hairline. The transformation was so dramatic that camera operators instinctively zoomed in to capture every detail of his obvious distress. "So your interruption tactics don't impress me, Mr. Miller. Your condescending tone does intimidate me, and your attempts to avoid accountability don't surprise me. What surprises me is that you thought they would work." Her words hung in the air, like a sword suspended over his reputation. The confidence that had carried him through hundreds of hostile interviews was nowhere to be found. The man who had built his career on never showing weakness was displaying it for millions of viewers. Crockett sat back in her chair, her voice returning to its calm, professional tone. The contrast between her composed demeanor and Miller's obvious agitation was striking, and the cameras captured every second of it. "Now, would you like to answer my original question about the family reunification database, or would you prefer to explain to the American people why you think the children you separated don't deserve answers?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Committee members leaned forward in their chairs. Spectators held their breath, and reporters frantically scribbled notes about what they were witnessing. Miller stared at her for a long moment. His entire body language transformed. The aggressive posture was gone. The smirk had vanished. The confident interruptions had stopped. "Are the processes we followed all applicable?" "Statutes," he stammered. "That's not what I asked." Crockett said simply, "I asked about the database. Did you create a system to track separated families, or not?" Another long pause. Miller looked around the room as if searching for help that wasn't coming. The system was handled by multiple agencies. "So that's a no." Crockett said you separated nearly 3,000 families without creating a way to put them back together. Thank you for that clarification. Even before the hearing ended, clips of the exchange were already going viral. Someone in the gallery had live streamed the entire confrontation, and the hashtag #MillerSilence was starting to trend on social media. The moment when Miller's voice cracked as he tried to defend the family separation policy was being shared thousands of times per minute. But the clip that really exploded was Crockett's line about being civil rights attorney who had dealt with intimidation tactics her entire career. "I faced down men who thought they could intimidate me into silence" became an instant meme, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of standing up to bullies in their professional and personal lives. Miller's attempts to regain his composure only made things worse. Every stammer response was captured, edited, and shared as evidence of what happens when someone finally stands up to tactics that had worked for years. Other committee members began jumping in to ask follow-up questions, sensing that Miller was now vulnerable in a way he'd never been before. Questions that might have been deflected, with interruptions and aggressive pivots, were now getting hesitant, uncertain responses. A Republican committee member tried to help Miller by asking a softball question about border security statistics, but even that backfired when Miller seemed unable to regain his confidence and gave a rambling, unfocused answer that only highlighted how rattled he'd become. The chairman eventually called for a brief recess, ostensibly to allow technical staff to adjust some equipment, but everyone in the room knew it was really to give Miller a chance to collect himself. During the break, reporters in the gallery were frantically typing on their phones, updating their editors about the dramatic confrontation they just witnessed. Political analysts were already preparing hot takes about the significance of seeing Miller, one of the most feared political combatants in Washington, reduced to stammering. deflections by a freshman congresswoman. But the most telling moment came when Miller's own staff approached him during the recess, instead of the confident strategy session that usually followed his testimony appearances. They huddled around him with concerned expressions, clearly trying to figure out how to recover from a disaster they'd never seen coming. Within 30 minutes of the hearing ending, number Miller silenced was a number one trending topic nationwide. But it wasn't just trending, it was dominating social media in a way that political moments rarely do. The 6-minute video of Miller's interruptions, followed by Crockett's devastating response, was being shared at a rate of thousands of times per minute. News organizations that had been covering other stories suddenly shifted their entire focus to breaking down what had just happened in that committee room. But the real viral moment wasn't just the political confrontation. It was what Crockett's response represented to millions of people who had experienced similar bullying tactics in their own lives. Finally, someone who knows how to handle a workplace bully read one tweet with 50,000 likes. "This is what it looks like when preparation meets opportunity," wrote another user, sharing the clip with hundreds of their followers. The most shared clip wasn't even a family separation database question. It was Crockett's line about dealing with men who thought they could intimidate her into silence. That 15-second soundbite was being shared by women in corporate boardrooms, students dealing with aggressive professors, and activists who had faced down hostile opponents. Political analysts were calling it one of the most significant committee hearing moments in years. Not because of any new policy revelations, but because of what it demonstrated about changing power dynamics in Washington. Miller had built his entire political brand on being undefeatable in verbal combat. He was a guy other conservatives called when they needed someone who could dominate a hostile interview or shut down aggressive questioners. His ability to control conversations through interruption and aggression had made him a legend among his supporters and a feared opponent among his critics. Political consulting firms had studied Miller's techniques and incorporated them into training programs for Republican candidates. His approach had become a template for how to handle hostile media environments and aggressive Democratic questioners. The Miller method was taught in workshops across conservative political circles, but Crockett had exposed a fundamental weakness in that approach. It only works when your opponent doesn't know how to handle it. Miller's tactics worked for years because most politicians aren't trained to deal with courtroom-style aggression, explained one former congressional staffer. But Crockett spent 15 years in civil rights law dealing with exactly these kinds of intimidation techniques. She knew how to let him hang himself. Conservative commentators tried to defend Miller by arguing that Crockett had been unfair or that she'd used gotcha questions, but those defenses only highlighted how completely the tables had turned. The man who had spent years dismissing his opponent's questions as gotcha politics was now being defended by supporters using the exact same language. Beyond the immediate political implications, the confrontation touched on something much broader: the changing nature of power and authority in American society. Miller represented an old-school approach to dominance. Interrupt, overwhelm, never let your opponent complete a thought. It was a strategy that had worked for decades in boardrooms, courtrooms, and political arenas where aggressive men could steamroll their opposition through sheer force of personality. Crockett represented something different: strategic patience, thorough preparation, and the confidence that comes from having survived real battles rather than just political theater. This wasn't just about immigration policy, wrote one political columnist. This was about what happens when someone who's used to winning through intimidation finally meets someone who can't be intimidated. The generational aspect of the confrontation wasn't lost on observers either. Miller, at 38, wasn't exactly old guard, but his tactics were rooted in an older style of political combat. Crockett, just 5 years older, represented a new generation of politicians who had cut their teeth in different kinds of battles: civil rights law, community organizing, and fights where the stakes were measured in human lives rather than political points. Miller's political team went into full damage control mode, but their efforts only seemed to make things worse. Their first instinct was to attack Crockett personally, questioning her qualifications and suggesting she had been unprofessional. Within hours of the hearing ending, Miller's communications director was on cable news shows trying to reframe the narrative Mr. Miller was trying to have, a substantive policy discussion, but Congresswoman Crockett was clearly more interested in creating viral moments than actual oversight, he told one host. But that strategy backfired spectacularly when videos of Miller's interruptions were played side by side with their statements about professionalism. Social media users began creating mashup videos showing Miller cutting off Crockett 6 times, while his spokespersons talked about the importance of respectful dialogue. The optics were devastating. Here was Miller's own team talking about professionalism while footage showed him repeatedly talking over a sitting member of Congress. The contrast was so stark that even some conservative commentators began distancing themselves from the defense strategy. Their second approach was to try to shift focus back to policy, substance, releasing detailed statements about immigration statistics and border security achievements. But those statements were largely ignored because the story had become about something much bigger than policy details. Miller himself remained largely silent for the first 48 hours after the hearing, which was unusual for someone who typically responded to criticism within hours. When he finally did speak, it was through a carefully worded statement that avoided any mention of the specific confrontation while defending his overall approach to immigration policy. The confrontation sent ripples throughout Washington's political establishment. Democrats who had previously been nervous about taking on aggressive Republican witnesses suddenly had a playbook for how to handle intimidation tactics. Crockett showed us that you don't fight bullies by being louder than them, explained one Democratic strategist. You fight them by being smarter and more prepared than them. Republican strategists, meanwhile, were quietly advising their clients to be more careful about when and how they deployed aggressive tactics. The Miller approach hadn't just failed. It had been turned into a weapon against itself. Several upcoming congressional hearings were reportedly restructured as witnesses and their counsel tried to avoid the kind of aggressive posturing that had worked so well for Miller in the past, but had proven so devastating when it finally backfired. Lost in much of the political analysis was a human element of what had transpired. Crockett's questions about the family reunification database weren't just political theater. They were about real children who had been separated from their parents, some of whom still hadn't been reunited years later. Immigration advocacy groups seized on the moment to renew calls for accountability and reform. Congresswoman Crockett did what we've been trying to do for years, said one advocate. She forced someone in power to confront the human cost of their policies without being able to hide behind political talking points. Families who have been affected by the separation policies began sharing their own stories on social media, using the viral moment as an opportunity to put human faces on statistics that Crockett had cited. Political observers began referring to the confrontation as the Crockett template, a new model for how to handle aggressive witnesses and hostile interviews. The template had several key elements: thorough preparation with specific facts and documentation, strategic patience to let aggressive opponents overextend themselves and the confidence to turn interruption tactics into evidence of bad faith. Miller's biggest mistake was thinking that interrupting someone 6 times would make him look strong, noted one political scientist. Instead, it made him look desperate and afraid of what she might say. Training organizations began incorporating the confrontation into their programs for political candidates and advocacy groups. This is now required viewing for anyone who might face hostile questioning, explained one trainer. As the immediate aftermath of the confrontation settled into longer-term analysis, several questions emerged about what the moment might mean for the future of political discourse. Would other aggressive political figures modify their tactics after seeing how spectacularly Miller's approach had backfired? Would witnesses be more careful about employing interruption, strategies that could be turned against them? More broadly, did the confrontation represent a shift in how political power operated, or was it simply one particularly effective politician deploying superior tactics? Against an overconfident opponent, the real test, wrote one columnist, will be whether this becomes a template that others can successfully use, or whether it was lightning in a bottle that worked. Specifically because of Crockett's unique background and preparation. But perhaps the most significant question was about representation and voice in American politics. For millions of viewers watching Crockett refuse to be, silence wasn't just political entertainment. It was a demonstration that someone like them could stand up to powerful figures who had previously seemed untouchable. 6 months later, the confrontation continued to be referenced in political discussions and training seminars. But its impact went far beyond politics. Business schools began using the video in courses about negotiation and conflict resolution. Law schools added it to curricula about courtroom, advocacy, and witness examination. Leadership training programs use it to illustrate the difference between aggression and strength. It became a case study in how preparation and strategic thinking can overcome what looks like superior force, explained one business professor who added the confrontation to her curriculum. The moment had also become a cultural touchstone for discussions about gender, race, and power in American society. Crockett's calm dismantling of Miller's aggressive tactics resonated with people who had faced similar challenges in their own professional and personal lives. She showed us that you don't have to match someone's energy to defeat them, wrote one commentator. Sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is absolute calm backed by absolute preparation. In the end, the confrontation between Stephen Miller and Jasmine Crockett became more than just a viral political moment. It became a masterclass in how to handle bullies, a demonstration of the power of preparation over aggression and proof that sometimes the most effective way to fight interruption is with precision. Miller had tried to control the conversation through volume and intimidation, tactics that had worked for him countless times before. His interruption strategy had been refined through years of practice, turning him into what many consider the most formidable witness in Washington. Political opponents had learned to fear facing him in public forums, but Crockett had turned those very tactics into evidence of his inability to defend his positions on their merits. Her legal background had taught her that aggressive witnesses often revealed their weakest points through their desperation to avoid certain topics. Every interruption became proof that he didn't want those questions answered. The 6 interruptions that were meant to silence her instead became the setup for a response that resonated with millions of people who had ever been talked over, dismissed, or intimidated by someone who thought their voice mattered more. And that 7th line, calm, factual, and absolutely devastating, proved that sometimes the quietest voice in a room can also be the most powerful. That's the political showdown that has everyone talking. And it's a perfect example of what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and when someone finally refuses to be silenced. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the most dramatic political confrontations in recent memory, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like these. What did you think of Crockett's strategy? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what happens when political bullying tactics finally meet their match. We'll see you in the next video where we'll break down the latest political drama that is Washington buzzing.